It's the Elephant in the Dome, the official podcast of the Washington State Senate Republican Caucus. I'm Tracy Ellis, joined by Senate Republican leader John Braun. Well, we're in the final stretch of the session now, and tensions are really rising over taxes. But what else is new? Governor Ferguson says the proposed income tax plan isn't even close to a done deal. He's calling for additional tax breaks, and he's warning that negotiators could run out of time before the session ends. So we talked about this a lot this session. Families are already feeling pretty squeezed. The affordability issue is huge. Businesses also watching very closely right now. So where do things stand right now? You just met with the governor. What can you tell us?
Well, yeah, you know, for all our disagreements, the governor has been good about meeting with Republicans regularly. We met yesterday afternoon and talked about a variety of issues. Income tax was one of them. We pushed him pretty hard on, okay, so how is it going? Do you think you're going to get the tax relief you want from the Democratic majorities? And what happens if they don't do it? Are you, are you willing to veto? Are we going to go into a special session? And we kind of laid all these questions out. We really didn't get an answer from him. I mean, you listened. I give him credit for that, but he didn't offer what happened next. He did say he still hoped that they would get it done. Of course, I disagree with that. I think it's bad for our state, bad for our economy, and ultimately bad for families because of that. But I do appreciate the governor's pushing for tax relief to be part of it. I don't have the sense that either the Senate or the House majorities are on the same page with him. Look, we saw some tax relief in the Senate. They added a little bit more at the end into being, I think, just around 20% of the revenue collected, which, by the way, is an enormous new tax. They do some kind of peripheral tax relief, but they went to the House. They pulled some of that tax relief out. I'm told there's a new striker that adds some other tax relief back in, but it just seems to me like two things. One, there's big disagreement within the Democratic side on what type of tax relief to do, and then also whether or not they should even do more tax relief. Many of them seem to be just eager for more money to spend on special interest.
He wants most of it, doesn't he? I think he wants most of it.
I think 50% is the number he has suggested, which I think is still too low.
Right.
But they've offered – the first bill that come out offered about 7% in tax relief, basically offered some minuscule reductions for individuals and then, frankly, a pretty good corporate tax reduction for big businesses. And then on the floor, they added another, kind of big, relief for big businesses and some – and I want to be fair, some of that would carry through into the cost of goods, so it would help people kind of in the second order stage, but not nearly, only a small fraction of what they're going to take out of people's pocket to begin with. And this whole – nonsense that it's just a high earners tax. It's not going to apply to everyone. I think that has been made pretty clear, both by comments from the majority leader and by, history here in Washington and around the country, where once they'll pitch a tax as just on the other guy, but once they need more money, which they clearly haven't solved their spending problem, they're coming after all of us.
The tax break for big businesses was on the Senate version, but they took that off in the House, right?
Yeah, right. That was the B&O surcharge. And it wasn't big, and it was in the out years. Basically, if I remember right, it was set to expire in 2030, and they moved it so it would expire in 2029 instead of 2030. This is a big deal for businesses, especially businesses that are nationwide or worldwide but are headquartered here in Washington. Think Microsoft, Amazon, T-Mobile, where they're paying a significant amount extra because they're headquartered here in Washington with that B&O surcharge. It's a big deal that's driving increases in the cost of goods here in Washington and, frankly, goods sold outside Washington. Not that we're paying particularly close attention to that, but what it really does is make our companies less competitive.
What do you say to the people who claim that was just merely a bribe to get big businesses not to lead the charge on the inevitable initiative to overturn this income tax if it is actually finally approved by the legislature and signed into law by the governor?
I don't think we can go too far into the initiative thing, but yeah, we have, essentially the public sector unions on one side and who's going to be on the other side. And I don't know. I have no special insight on whether there was a deal struck between the large businesses and the Democrats, but it is certainly disappointing that they have stayed on the sidelines, at least officially, when it comes to the income tax. Many of them have privately say they oppose it. They think it's a bad idea. They understand, even if it doesn't hit them directly, that it's going to affect our economy broadly. But all that notwithstanding, they've not done anything. I don't know. I mean, if there was a deal, and again, I don't know there was a deal, I would think that the Democrats taking that part back out of the bill would undermine that deal. But we haven't seen them come out forcefully opposed to it so far. So whatever their reasons, it's not moving them yet.
You said this is a huge thing. And we think, okay, it's just a new tax, but it's so far beyond that. I mean, that you'd have to create a whole new system at the Department of Revenue to figure out who's paying this tax, how to collect it. You've been skeptical from the very beginning that they could do this in a short session. Now the governor is kind of adding to that, saying, I don't know if it's going to get done this session. You think there's a chance that it dies this session? I mean, obviously only to be brought back next session, but I mean, for now?
Well, I think the odds are still with the proponents. Frankly, they have the numbers. They have a clear desire, and their base is pushing for it. But the public, as the public learns about it, the public are overwhelmingly, and this isn't just Republicans or independents, this is Republicans, independents, and Democrats are overwhelmingly opposed to it. Whether you look at the numbers that signed in opposed to it in committee, or you read the mail that me and every other legislator is getting. And by the way, I'll encourage folks to keep sending it, because that's the stuff that really changes the minds of legislators when they hear from real people. This is deeply unpopular and growing more so as people get more familiar with it. And it's not just a bill. It's not just the worst bill this year. It's not even the worst bill in my 14 years in the legislature. I think it's certainly the worst bill in the 21st century, and maybe in the last 100 years. The long-term impact to our state's economy is enormous. And I'll give you a couple examples. One, this bill very clearly goes after what I consider the core of our economy. Those, smallish or mid-sized companies, they employ 50 to 500 people that over the next 10 years will grow to 300 to 1,000 people. That's where the economic growth is in our state. This is a big deal, and this bill makes them uncompetitive. And the way those companies grow, it's certainly some of them do business only in Washington State, but most of them are building something or providing a service and selling it across the country or across the world. And now, under this bill, they would have a 10% disadvantage over all their competitors. It just won't work long term. We will lose the growth, or we'll just lose the companies entirely. And then more broadly, if you're an innovator, if you're somebody looking to start Microsoft, Amazon, Costco, Starbucks, list goes on and on, why would you come to Washington to do that? There's better places to do that. And the people that have the wherewithal, the intelligence, the work ethic, the grit to go build these businesses, they're not dummies. They're going to go somewhere else. And so not just now, but future generations of Washington are not going to benefit, with the pretty nice economy we've had. I think we've been enormously fortunate with our economy here in Washington for decades, and the Democrats just kind of bit by bit want to destroy it.
Do you think the governor... We've talked about this before. A governor represents the entire state. Legislators represent their constituents in districts. We've heard Democrats say, my constituents keep on saying they want these progressive taxes. You're hearing from constituents who say, we don't want an income tax, even though there's not a lot of people in Centralia or Chehalis who are going to be paying it, but they still don't want it. But do you think the governor sees the bigger picture? I mean, he's a smart guy, right? I mean, you think he sees a possible threat to our economy, into what's made the state so great?
I don't know. I'd like to think he does. I mean, certainly his perspective as a statewide elected official is different than a legislator that's elected by district. I will say, even the folks from Seattle who say, hey, this is really popular in my district, if they look at the folks who signed in con for the committees, and we got that broken down by county or even by district, you'll find out, they may be hearing from the folks in their district who like it. Well, there are plenty of folks, even in Democratic districts, who very much dislike the income tax. So I don't think I think they like what they're hearing because they're hearing the folks that are telling them, hey, you're doing the right thing, but they're not really listening that broadly. But back to your point, is the governor, just by the nature of his office, listening more broadly? I think there's a good argument. He's certainly not told me that, but his actions say he at least understands that people across the state are really struggling with affordability, and just adding more taxes, even if it's not taxing them today, people know that's going to add to their cost of living, and that's not good for them. So I think at some level he gets that. He hasn't been willing to push back on the tax overall, which is unfortunate, but at least he's been willing to say there's got to be more tax relief. I mean, which is just logical. I mean, for years they keep saying, "Oh, the tax system is upside down; it's regressive," blah, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think all that is true. When they say that, they're relying on very partisan analysis. But if it is, if you buy it as true and you're logical, you would say, "Hey, I got to reduce some of those regressive taxes." Instead, we've seen year after year, including the record-breaking one last year, and a few tax increases that have passed out of the Senate this year that are more regressive taxes. You can't you can't have it both ways, in my view. You can't say it's regressive and yet be willing to continue to add more regressive taxes, or when you pass what they consider a progressive income tax, don't use that money to eliminate taxes, eliminate the property tax, reduce the sales tax, reduce the gas tax. Any of these things would be enormously progressive if they really meant what they're saying.
I mean, you have to look to our progressive neighbors to the south. I mean, Oregon's an extremely progressive state like Washington. They have an income tax, no sales tax.
That's right.
At all. I mean, there's no proposal here in Washington for anything like that.
No, I mean the big ones here, and it's really interesting. The sales tax is surprisingly popular, really across economic thresholds.
It is interesting.
I don't really completely understand that, other than I would say people see that as a choice, right? That they say I get to make a choice depending on what I buy, how much sales tax on. So maybe that's why. I can't really say for sure, but I'll tell you one that's really deeply unpopular and is pretty regressive is the property tax. We have a high and one that's grown substantially in recent years and adds to a big problem in our state, which is the cost of housing. So unfortunately, nobody on the Democrat side is out there talking about how we're going to reduce the property tax. The only people talking about that right now are Republicans.
I want to remind you of a couple things real quick. First off, Senator Braun mentioned contact legislators, contact the governor, and you're going to say, how do I do that? Well, the best way is to go to ledge.wa.gov. Ledge.wa.gov. It's actually a fantastic website. It gets you up to date on everything that's happening in the legislature. It will provide all the contact information there that you need for every single member of the legislature, both in the Senate and the House and the governor's office. That's ledge.wa.gov. The other thing I want to remind you to do is make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would really appreciate that. And subscribe to the podcast as well. There are ways to do that, but you could go to the website. If you go to Washington State Senate Republicans, Google that, you'll find our website, and there are ways to subscribe to everything right there. We've got all sorts of products that you might be interested in. So beyond the income tax, what else did you discuss with the governor in your meeting? We should also mention that the Republican leader in the House was there as well. I think
that's right. Representative Stokesbury.
Representative Stokesbury.
Meet with them together.
Yeah, you met with them together. What else did you talk about in that meeting? I know you want to be careful.
I want to be careful, but nothing really all that surprising, right?
Right.
We talked about the operating budget, and I shared with him my very deep concerns about the infirmities in the operating budget that the Senate's Democrats voted out last week. It spends $5 billion more than we take in. It uses one-time money, raids the rainy day fund, raids the future revenues going into the rainy day fund. It proposes $800 million in savings, but doesn't say how it's going to happen. It is a badly constructed budget. And the last thing I'd say is it assumes, this gets kind of deep in the weeds, but it assumes a 2.5% growth rate in the out years, which normally you'd say, that's
what is that? What are you talking about? 2.5%? You mean it assumes the budget will grow 2.5% every year?
Yeah, in the next biennium.
Okay, sorry, the next couple of years.
Yes. So in the next couple of years.
Well, that sounds good. You would be, 2.5%. That's about.
I would say
that's
really good. That's
yeah.
terrific. So you think that's a really good thing. Here's the concern I have is in the this will be the 9th session. The Democrats have had the majority in both chambers. They've grown by an average of 15%.
Oh, so you don't think that's going to happen?
So I don't think there's any way they can do that. I would tell you right off the top, to grow at 2.5%, they would have to say no to the collective bargaining agreement that will be negotiated this summer. I don't think they're willing to do that. They've never been willing to do that before. So, and here's the thing: if they're not willing to do that, and it grows, just say it grows by, say it grew by their average of 15%, and you do the math, that creates a $10 billion deficit in next biennium, which means we've had these 2 sessions in a row. They walked in with a big deficit, and their answer has been taxes. What are they going to do? And when they walk in, if this plays out as it very well might, and they got a $10 billion deficit, can we really handle?
Well, so that's the governor has said that he doesn't want to be back here year after year talking about deficits and how we're going to how we figure this out. He said that.
Yes.
You're saying that this is. It's almost obvious to you that there will be more deficits because there's no way they're going to just.
This is 100% setting up a big deficit next year and the year after and the year after. They are not willing, have not been willing so far to get after their spending issues.
Well, he doesn't want that. He said that. So do you think?
Something's got to give.
Right. Exactly.
So, either the voters have to say no, we don't want any more taxes and weigh in, or the governor's got to stand up and say no. I get it. I'm a state elected official. I get that we can't handle more taxes. Somebody's got to, and we're going to have to stop our spending. You don't fix the tax issue until you fix the spending issue.
Yeah.
Was my main point
right.
to the governor is we're having all this talk about income tax, and last year we talked about other taxes, and we're going to oppose those. But until you actually get after the spending issue, you're not going to solve the problem.
You have some other concerns, too. You mentioned before, talking with the governor, some things you wanted to talk about. Obviously, get into these things and your time runs out. You relate to
We talked about a few other things that I brought up. I brought up the fact that here we are for several years in a row. There doesn't look like there's any meaningful policy coming out of the legislature to protect kids. We've had this real tragic spike in the death of children, often very young, and infants, as a result of exposure to fentanyl. Historic rise, and Republicans have pushed hard on this, both in the Senate, where I had a bill, and there's a couple other bills, including one by Senator Torres, and then on the House side, Representative Couture has had some bills to try to get after this issue. In every case, they have died in the House committee. They're just standing in the way, and so I told the governor, look, if you ought to care about this, and you're going to have to weigh in. These are the folks in your party running the committee saying that your party does not have the votes for that. I don't think that's true, as evidenced by the fact that the one bill that we did passed overwhelmingly in the Senate. But we have a few people in the Democratic caucus on the House side that are standing in the way of bills that will save the lives of young children.
You go talk to his employees. Remember, he's the executive for the state. So that means he's the big boss. He's like the CEO for Department of Children and Youth Services, for example, right?
Right.
Department.
Children, Youth, and Families.
Youth and Families. Thank you. But that's his department. There are people from his department. I know that this is the case because legislators have told me this, that they're coming to you and saying, we need your help on the legislative side to fix things to make our jobs easier, take care of kids, and you're saying Democrats aren't allowing that to happen, especially one committee. And you always mention this one committee chair who seems just to be against.
Yeah, he says he just doesn't have the votes. I don't believe that, for one thing. But even if you don't have the votes, he won't even bring them for a hearing. And this is, like in the case of the bill I passed that added fentanyl to the endangerment statute, it passed with 41 votes in the Senate.
Because you may have heard, if you listen to this podcast regularly, we did a podcast about this. We had Nice Lee from, she represents foster parents, and came on and talked with us about this. Yes. And they were going to put pressure on, all sorts of groups are putting pressure to get this bill, your bill on fentanyl and endangerment passed. And you're saying that just died and it's over now.
Yep. No. And other bills that, frankly, in some ways, were more meaningful policy and not even a hearing. let alone passed. It's unconscionable in my mind. So I weighed in with the governor on that. I said, hey, look, this clearly is going to take more leadership if we're going to move on that. And he listened. He didn't respond, but I'm hopeful. I also talked about a similar situation in juvenile rehabilitation. We're on our third year now where we've had this JR 25 program that's not working. We got overcrowding in Green Hill. It's leading to all kinds of problems. Some, where people in the care of the state are being injured. And frankly, there's both, the tragic nature of injury and, the tort liability cost that's eating us alive. And we look like we're going to leave this session again without meaningful policy for the Department of Children, Youth, and Families to manage the population.
I don't understand, because there seems to be bipartisan support for that.
Because there's just a few people on both sides of the rotunda who want to combine it. They insist that they combine it with very controversial policy that changes the sentencing guideline. They're basically saying, hey, we should fix this by not sending young people who commit very serious crimes. Remember, this juvenile rehabilitation isn't like it was 20 or 30 years ago where you might end up in juvie because you shoplifted or you trespassed or you did something. That doesn't happen anymore. If you're in the juvenile rehabilitation program, you commit a serious crime, often a violent crime, murder, assault, rape, sexual assault, sometimes armed robbery falls in there. These are serious offenses, and the goal by some of the members of the Democratic Party is to reduce those sentences so those folks who commit those crimes, they don't ever go to juvenile rehabilitation. They don't ever go to prison. They just send them back out the door. And we absolutely know when this happens, because it's happening in isolated cases, particularly in Kenton County, that there's a huge chance that those folks go out and reoffend, and that's bad for everybody. It's particularly bad for the victim. They seem to be almost. It's almost like they don't care about either the current victims or the future victims. Very, very frustrating. But that's why the broadly supported policy that would allow the agency to manage the population in a reasonable way, it can't get through there because they keep tying it to this very controversial policy, and it doesn't even have the votes on the Democratic side. I want to be clear about this. If this is so controversial, they don't have any votes on the Republican side, but they have strong majorities, and they can't even get their votes on the Democratic side. And yet there's a few folks who say, nope, no reasonable policy can go forward until this crazy policy gets approved.
I've heard you and Democrats talk about on the same bill about making life better for the people who are incarcerated. You may believe that, they should they need to stay in there, but when they're in there, you want them to be able to get, schooling. You want them to be able to get, be able to have recreation. You told me this. You said that, and they aren't getting any of that. There's being warehoused, and there's no rehabilitation going on, right?
Yeah, the whole idea behind the JR 25 program, which I didn't support, and I still think it's wrongheaded, but part of the reason it's wrongheaded is because we can't deliver on it. Right, notionally, the idea that you're going to take these relatively young folks, and it all applies to juveniles who were sentenced as adults. By the way, that doesn't happen unless they commit very serious crimes. And the argument the other side will make is, hey, they're young, their brains aren't fully formed, they made bad decision, we should help them get on a better path. Well, notionally, I'm not opposed to that. I do think there have to be consequences for these very serious crimes, but if you're going to do it, you got to do it well, and they don't even seem to want to do it well, because when the overcrowding at Green Hill means we can't deliver the services, whether it's K-12, basic education, higher ed in some cases, counseling, substance abuse services, all the things that would you'd think would help these folks who have got off on a terrible path get back on a better path. We're not even delivering that, and instead of setting their very progressive agenda aside to get the basic rules passed, they've tied them together in a way that means we're going to go home likely in a week and a half, and there's not going to be any policy that helps the agency manage the population.
Again, this is the governor's agency. I mean,
right.
You're just trying to help his
He's got to weigh in.
Right.
He's got to weigh in more forcefully if he wants this stuff to happen.
It's been emotional on the Senate floor. It's been emotional on the House floor. I know that this has been a tough session in a lot of respects. Maybe for both sides. I mean, they're very.
Well,
Democrats are very emotional right now for a lot of reasons, but the bottom line is there has been a lot of emotion, and you're getting tired right now. What do you want to accomplish? What are your top priorities in these final days?
That's a great question, and you're right. This is the time of session. If people are tired, can be a little bit grumpy, and this is the time when you got to go to put in the extra effort to not do that, because you're going to be most effective if you stay calm and you make the better argument. And you may not win it the very first time, but if you make the better case, I still believe you'll win eventually. And sometimes it takes a few years, sometimes it takes a few days, but nonetheless you got to make the argument. In the remaining days, we talked about some very important policies. It's very limited opportunity to save those, sadly.
Right.
The things we can influence in the few days I have left is we're still on the floor in the Senate, and there's some policy that came up from the House, some of which is, a little bit that's good, but much of which is bad. And so we're going to work hard to stop it where we can, to make it less bad where we can. In a few cases, we'll even make it good. The biggest issue, though, is the budget. To the extent we're able to impact the operating budget in particular, and sadly, the way the system works, we don't have a lot of options. They pass it on both sides on a partisan vote, and they go to conference, and it's basically in a room until it pops out. So I don't know that we have a lot of options. We got to keep trying. And then I think, we talked about it before, everything we can do to stop both the income tax, which, as I said, worst bill in many decades, and some of the other taxes that are going to hit people even more directly than that.
Affordability. This was when you came into the session, you said affordability was your number one thing. That you were going to look at every bill, everything you did here through that lens of affordability. Is life getting more expensive for Washingtonians after this session?
I believe it is, unfortunately, in spite of the fact that my colleagues on the other side of the have figured out how to say affordability. They really don't understand what it means and what the policy proposals they are putting forward are doing to affordability. They continue to think more government, more taxes are good for affordability, and they manifestly are not.
All right, so next week will be our final in-session version of this podcast, and so we'll have a lot of new information. Things move fast and furious this last week, so we'll have a lot of new information for you. You'll want to join us then. You'll also want to subscribe to our YouTube channel and subscribe to this podcast. Just go to the Washington State Senate Republican Caucus website. You could do that there. Again, if you want to reach out to your legislators or the governor, go to ledge.wa.gov. Senator Braun, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Great.
And this has been the Elephant in the Dome, the official podcast of the Washington State Senate Republican Caucus.